Audacious rebel.
So I think, again, women who are capable in areas are told to minimize that capacity for the sake of this mandate. Men who are incapable in areas are told they've got to function in gifts. Oxen are told to fly. Birds are told to dive to the depths of the ocean, and fish are expected to carry the plow, and we're just not equipped for it because again, we're assigned things by our maleness, right? The fact that our genitalia says you should have the capacity to handle finances, handle parenting, handle life direction and career. And again, that's that external narrative. The external narrative creates a vacuum that the internal story, the falling dominoes that came into my life before I was born, they were there in utero, those dominoes were falling. When I hatched out of the womb, those dominoes kept falling. And as I stepped into my personhood, I am, who even knows what the original me looks like? Who even knows what the original you looks like? There's something in me that wants to relate, that wants to connect, that wants to create, that wants to be vulnerable. But there's something outside of me that tells me that to fulfill the outline, to occupy the space as man, I've got to somehow betray that part of who I am. And so there's a lot of lonely men related to lonely women. A lot of lonely children parented by lonely fathers. In fathers who are disconnected internally are surrounding and expected to support families who are byproducts of that internal disconnection. And then it becomes rinse and repeat over generations. He said, and I was in my 40s now, having my normal. He said, I was looking at something that was normal and healthy, but it struck me as abnormal. Why? Because of the conditioning of the thinker, the feeler, and the chooser. So how can we stop that? How can we prevent that? We got to stop playing games. And again, I go back to church. I go back to faith systems, because that's the most common way people are exposed to new thought. And when we're playing games behind the pulpit, instead of giving people a way to live larger, a way to push back against those dysfunctional dominoes, we got creeds, we got doctrines, we got weaponized religion, who's in, who's out, who's going to hell, and politics. But we don't have a way in which people can walk out and thrive more in the micro and macro society. And so,
audacious rebel. Audacious rebel.
Welcome back to the path of the audacious rebel. This is episode 3 in our special series focused on the man, the male gender, and his role in the cycles of crime, trauma, and transformation. In this series, we explore how men, whether directly or indirectly, are central to the conversation around crime. But more importantly, we seek to understand the conditions that create those outcomes. In our first episode, we heard from Rondell Fields, president of the Single Fathers Association of Trinidad and Tobago. He unpacked the systemic and societal imbalances that work against men, especially in the areas of fatherhood and justice. Then came Mr. Kent Ballard Jr., educator, policymaker, and advocate. And Kent spoke about absent fathers, emotional trauma, and how those early wounds shape the behaviors we later label as crime. And today we continue this journey with a voice that lives at the intersection of faith, justice, and wisdom. Michael T. Smith has spent over 30 years in pulpit ministry, guiding lives, confronting systems, and calling for spiritual truth. But he didn't remain confined to the pulpit. In 2020, he launched Nothing Else Matters, a powerful 150-episode series confronting the decline of the modern church and calling for reformation rooted in Christ's consistent living. In 2024, he created The Church Of, a new model for people of goodwill to activate their spiritual energy toward justice and healing. Michael is a storyteller, an author, consultant, and a sacred disruptor. unafraid to speak about race, dignity, sex, relationships, and childhood with vulnerability, nuance, and boldness. He's been recognized for his work addressing systemic racism, generational poverty, and violence. And at his core, Michael is a lover of wisdom and a courageous voice in our time. He lives in Atlanta with his wife Connie and their two children, Olivia and Michael II. Please join me in welcoming to the path of the audacious rebel, Michael T. Smith. Michael.
Wonderful to be here. That I'm listening to that thing and I'm like, man, who are they talking about there? Just sometimes you sit and pause and go, golly, I've been at this a long time. So thank you so much
Oh
for having me
yes,
on. This
oh
is
yes,
this is
oh
really
yes.
beautiful. This is really beautiful.
So you apparently you've been at this part all your lifetime because you look no more than 35, Michael.
Thank you, thank you. When I was 12, I would never get invited to the stuff that the teens and stuff were doing, and they were like, you're too young. I'm like, no, I'm not, no, I'm not. And then when I was 16, they was like, you look 12, and my mother was like, when you're 60, this will be a great thing for you. Just relax.
Okay. Michael, you've been in the pulpit for over 30 years. In that time, you've likely counseled countless couples, both before and after marriage. You've stood at the altar, officiated in unions, and walked with people through the pain of divorce for reasons ranging from probably A to Z. The ideology of the church often places the man as the head of the home. But in your experience across all the roles men play as sons, as fathers, as husbands, as employees and employers, what do you think is one of the most critical issues men are facing in our contemporary society?
Man, um, to me, uh, everything is narrative. The internal narrative, the external narrative, and how those um, cooperate and conflict, uh, kind of in this rhythm. Um, the narrative of what manhood is, um, what manhood has been tasked by society to be, the warrior, the protector, the provider, um, which all of those things have been necessary throughout time, for the thriving of humanity, for the thriving of the carrying forth of human society. But underneath that narrative, is a narrative of the distance of self knowledge, the
Mm,
distance of giving permission to recognize how the external narrative conflicts with just the simple matter of personhood. And sometimes men, especially, are asked to ignore their personhood, their sense of personhood, for the sake of fulfilling that external narrative. And so, aggression or violence or hypersexuality or all of these things, these external narratives, in conflict with boys who don't start out that way, boys who start out, I mean, certainly rowdy, certainly hyperactive, all the things we say boys will be boys, but over time, we're told to put those sensitivities down, to put those empathies down, to put our connection with our mothers, our connection with femininity, our admiration for femininity down. Um, and we're taught, as we get out in the company of men, what is celebrated and what is to be ridiculed. And I think so much of that dysfunction, maritally, as sons, as fathers, as siblings, uh, stems from that conflicting narrative that there's something in me that wants to relate, that wants to connect, that wants to create, that wants to be vulnerable. But there's something outside of me that tells me that to fulfill the outline, to occupy the space as man, I've got to somehow betray that part of who I am.
mm,
And so there's a lot of lonely men related to lonely women, a lot of lonely children parented by lonely fathers, in
mm,
fathers who are disconnected internally, are surrounding and expected to support families who are byproducts of that internal disconnection, and then it becomes rinse and repeat over generations. um, and I mean, that's you're right, that's thousands of couples, thousands of families. But if I had to sum it up, that's what I would say.
wow. You know, in a way, you've already outlined the 5 or 6 questions that I had to ask,
Uh-oh.
but
did
I'm
I did
still
I did
going
I
there.
skip ahead? Sorry about that.
There's a quote which states that one cannot lead where they have not walked. There's a scripture which says that the man is the head of the home. Not only is that principle echoed in churches, but in mosques, in temples, and
Sure.
ascribed to in various cultures and societies globally. But, Michael, how do we reconcile that divine expectation with the reality that so many men today are broken, fragmented, and unresolved? How can a man lead a home when he himself is the product of a broken home, unsure of who he is, wrestling with wounds that were never addressed, and unclear about what headship even looks like? From your experience working with men over the years, what happens when a man is given such an authority without the inner alignment to carry it?
Well, again, I mean, and I love this because you are hitting the very core of the issue. There is a religious narrative uh, throughout, like you say, the Abrahamic faiths and even beyond culture and even non-faith cultures. This idea of the masculine being the lead. Of course, there's the Etruscan narratives and societies, but by and large, men who are not up to the task are
Mhm,
asked to lead, and women uh, who have to place their confidence in an incomplete vessel are
mhm,
asked to minimize their personhood for the sake of that spiritual expectation. Now, I I worship God, if I can say. Um, my worship of God is rooted in the Christ tradition, but not necessarily in Christianity, not necessarily in those biblical edicts. I have found that um, marriages, all relationships, in fact, households thrive, in fact, from a sense of equal community and equal accountability, from a place of shared servanthood, from shared outpouring and infilling. So I think, again, women who are capable in areas are told to minimize that capacity for the sake of this mandate. Men who are
mhm,
incapable in areas are told they've got to function in gifts. You know, oxen are told to fly. Birds are told to dive to the the depths of the ocean, and fish are expected to carry the plow, and we're just not equipped for it because again, um, we're assigned things by our maleness, right? The fact that our genitalia says you should have the capacity to handle finances, handle parenting, handle life direction and career. And again, that's that external narrative. The external narrative creates a vacuum that the internal story, the falling dominoes that came into my life before I was born, they were there in utero. Those dominoes were falling. When I hatched out of the womb, those dominoes kept falling. And as I stepped into my personhood, um, I am who even knows what the original me looks like? Who even knows what the original you looks like? We're all an agitated version of ourselves, trying to recover our true essence while society, while the scripture, while the church, while the faith is demanding that we feel something that we don't have. And so I had to break out of that. I had to break out of that even in my own marriage. I just went in say my personal conviction on it is that marriage is 5 parts. It's kind of 3 parts best friend, partner, and equal. 1 part caregiver and support. There's a nurturing aspect of it. That it's almost a parenting aspect where even if you're married, there's an innocence inside the man, an innocence inside the woman that needs that parental comfort, that parental acceptance. And then, of course, we have the physical, well, what I would say the 5 parts, the fifth part, 1 part lover. And the posture of partnership is side by side, the posture of lovers face to face. And then there's this inverted where one pours into the other and the other pours into the one. That seems to be a more healthy narrative to give space for process, to give space
right.
for Here's what I'm biologically, physiologically, my brain, these are the parts that I don't have those gifts. Here's the part that my narrative, my story enriched me, and the parts that it left me depleted. And hopefully those things are coming together in partnership with a spouse that recognizes that same abundance, that same lack, that same unequal stacking. A perfect person, Bernard, would be um, 10 equal stacks of 10. I got all my stacks in a row, 10, 10, 10, 10. But really what we are is we're strong over in this area. I'm a 15, which means there's something depleted in this area. And when men recognize that and enter into relationship with women who recognizes that, now we're celebrating strengths and bolstering weaknesses. And now out comes the daughters who know that I'm not expecting the man to be everything. But I'm also not minimizing who I am for the sake of a narrative. The sons that know it's okay to be in process and that we all have what we've inherited, but hopefully we leave a little less chaos behind than was passed down to us, at once heirs and progenitors of this chaos. That seems to be more of a healthy narrative than saying, oh, you're the one with the penis. Guess what? You're in charge of everything. Here's the keys to the plane. Fly it, without that capacity. And so, again, I feel like you ask these questions and it touches the deepest part of my stirring. So if I ramble, I don't mean to take over the whole time, but I'll
That's
stop right
wonderful.
there.
That's wonderful.
I
I've
hope
got
that
no
gets
problem with
close.
that, Michael. You could ramble as long as you like.
Okay.
We reflect on that long-standing ideology of the man as the head of the home and the many challenges and internal contradictions that come with that expectation. But alongside this spiritual designation, society hands men an unwritten script, as you identified earlier, to be the provider, the protector, the disciplinarian, the fixer, roles many are neither equipped for nor ever truly invited to define for themselves. And even when those roles are accepted, there's no universal meaning. For instance, discipline to a man raised in the Caribbean during the boom generation may look very different from how a Gen Z man in Europe may understand it. So, my question is, how do we begin to unpack these generational and cultural interpretations of manhood? And what happens when men are judged by roles that were never clearly defined in the first place?
So, so I'll start with this. So the idea of Christ, and again, I'm coming at the big truth. I mean, if I was a practitioner of Islam, if I was a Jew, if I was a Muslim, I might come at the. I mean, if I was a Hindu, I would come at the big truth from a different angle. But for
Right,
me, somewhere between the idea of the biblical Christ and the historical Christ and the mythical Christ, right? Somewhere in the middle of
right,
that is the actual Christ, and what that represents. Uh, Christ, and in the narrative sense, is both in the narrative is God taking on human form, but that is without gender, right? So Christ, at sometimes he is the son, he is the king, but other times he's the gathering hen who gathers her brood. So these are what I'm saying is a lot of discussion. 12 podcasts worth of discussion, but I say this: there has to be somewhere some sort of ideal. And I think somewhere we know internally what that ideal is, that according to my faith tradition, human beings are image seeded, imago Dei, with the knowledge of love, an intuitive knowing, but we are chaos conditioned. Our large self, our small self, the chaos conditioning of our small self to sometimes take what we call normal, and it is an unchecked, unchallenged normal. It's a millstone normal. It's been grinding along for so long. No one even thinks to question it. It just
yes,
goes in that direction, and it's it reminds me of an old story of this lady. She married this man, and they went together for the holidays, and the mother-in-law brought out the turkey with the this man married this woman. She brought out on their first holiday. This woman brought out the turkey with the legs cut off and on the side, and
yes.
He says, why did you do that? And she said, well, my mother always did it. And so went to the mother-in-law's house at the next holiday, and the turkey came out. Why did you do that? Well, my mother always did it. Finally, they got to the grandmother and said, sure enough, the turkey comes out with the legs off. He says, what is going on with the turkey and the legs? And the grandmother says, well, baby, my oven's only this big, right? I can't fit it in there with the legs on, right? And
Right.
so this idea of uh, uh, normal. Who defines normal? Who determines normal? That's why I bring up the idea of Christ, that somewhere there's got to be a model, and maybe you can't get there through Christ. You know, some people have tremendous trouble when we talk about Father God. They say Father God, they're projecting Father is abusive, Father is critical, Father is absent. And so we have to come at it through a way that it connects us and resonates with that deepest, that highest self, kind of in a Jungian psychological way, the not the shadow self, but the large self, the high self. So to answer the question, uh, so much of what we survived, we perpetuate without any critical consideration of, just because I survived this doesn't mean I need to pass it on. And we celebrate kind of incorrectly. Well, this is where I came from, and you know, this type of abuse or this type of aggression or this type of coldness, this is where I came from, and look at me, look how well I'm doing. And a lot of times we say, look how well I'm doing as a man, but it's the man saying how well he's doing. And what we need to know is all the people in that man's life, as they're partakers of the fruit, they should be the ones that tell how the man is doing. A friend of mine went to vacation in Amish country. He's a pastor from Nigeria, from Lagos, and he was there, and he was staying on this Amish farm, and he really didn't understand, you know, their life. And so they were talking with his host at breakfast, and my pastor friend's asking all these questions, and he's like, well, are you guys Christians? He said, oh yeah. Yeah, we believe. He says, so you believe the Bible? And he's, oh yeah, we believe the Bible. And you believe in Christ? And da da da. And he says, oh yeah. And so finally, my pastor friend, he says, well, are you born again? And the Amish host said, he said, well, I'm not qualified to answer that question. He said, why not? He said, well, to find out if I'm born again, you'd have to ask my neighbor. To find out who I am as a man, you really can't ask me how well I'm doing. You have to ask the beneficiaries, the partakers of who I am as a man. So my wife, who am I to her? My children, who am I to them? My neighbor, who am I to them? The stranger on the street, who am I to them? And so now we get into maybe challenging, well, this is what my father did, or what I was told a man doesn't cry, or this is what I was told discipline was. You strip down, you get naked, you get beat with that extension cord, or you don't get good on a test, and now you can't go to prom. That's, that illogical consequences. That's my normal, and I perpetuate that normal without challenging it. So we need some sort of model. And if we think at the highest level, maybe God, maybe we can't connect to God. So we connect to the prophet, or we connect to the Messiah, or we connect to some placeholder. Maybe we can't connect there. But now, who among us has the fruit of children and neighbors and siblings who are partaking and basking in the largeness of spirit of that man? And maybe just that example. I had a situation where my son took a pin one time and carved in the hood of my car, number one car, because he wanted to make it like a race car. And I came out of church, and the whole hood of my car, 3 feet by 3 feet, he had carved with a ballpoint pen. And some of my adjutants were there, some of my associates were there, and I went out and I was like, dude, what did you do? He goes, I made us a race car, Dad. I was like, okay, no, we don't do that. We don't scratch in the car. We don't do that. It wasn't even my car. It was a loaner. And he goes, oh, if I had known it was a loaner, I wouldn't have scratched it. And I said, I don't care if it's a loaner or it's my car. Don't scratch in any car. The point is that I got him in. I said, well, we'll figure it out. I said, but don't do that, buddy. That's not, you have to think about things like that. And I put him in the car seat and we went on home. But the people around me were like, they told me later, man, I would have absolutely lost it. Man, if I had done that growing up, I would have been crushed. I would have been beat for a week. And so maybe we can't get to God, maybe we can't get to Christ, but maybe there's little examples of manhood around us that provoke a higher way. And we need those examples. We need those models. We need those elders, because a lot of men don't have it within them. But sometimes I tell them, well, who do you look at that speaks to that love in you? Is it an uncle? Is it a neighbor? Can you imitate that person? Can you ask yourself, what would Uncle Fred do? And kind of move yourself to fill in the vacuum, maybe drawing upon something externally that was never deposited internally. And this, to me, is why things like this are important, because until men are in a place to even consider that, The dominoes keep on falling as they've always fallen. And, Dr. Phil, I can't believe I'm quoting Dr. Phil, and whatever, peace be unto him. But Dr. Phil says the opposite of dysfunction is dysfunction. And sometimes you grow up in a place, you say, my parents yelled all the time and I don't want to be like them. But you move from the dysfunction of yelling all the time to total silent. And you don't talk through the issues,
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, I'm doing the opposite of my parents, but I've moved from one dysfunction to the other. So we need that constant stirring, provocation, challenging around us that there is a higher way. And if we can't get that out of a spiritual idea, then maybe those elders, maybe those neighbors, maybe a stranger, just watching a stranger talk to their child in a store versus the way we were talked to. And those things can be ways to kind of circumvent where we came from to get us what we need to be men today, and whatever that means in the larger context.
So what I'm hearing is like we need models, we need mentors, we need models that we can learn from.
Yeah. Yeah. So when my birth father drank himself up, he was out of my life when I was 1. Very complicated story for another time. But my mom remarried, and when I was 9, I was adopted. And this, I had never, growing up with a single mom, we didn't have tools, we didn't have hammers, we didn't have screwdrivers. When we wanted to hang a picture, my mom took one of her shoes and hung a picture. When something needed to be unscrewed, she said, "Go get a butter knife." And so that's how So she married this guy. He showed up with tool chest and box and saw and stuff. I had never seen it before, and so we're there, and it's within a couple of months of marriage. He says, "Hey, we're going to build a fort in the backyard." And I'm like, "A fort, man, that's great." So we're sitting down, and I'm, grabbing the plywood. He goes, no, let's build a frame for it. So he's showing me how to build a frame, and he hands me the hammer and the nails, and he says, "All right, go hammer this in." And I picked up the hammer, holding it right under the claw, and I'm pushing it like this. And he walked over. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, I'm hammering it in." He said, No. You hold it down here, and then you get the weight of the head of the hammer. That's where the motion comes from. And what I had a tool, but no model to use it.
Right.
And tools are one thing, but a model demonstrating how it's done, we need that. And so pastors and priests and rabbis and shamans and these people become important in our lives. Professors, coaches, they become because it's like, okay, here's the tool. I read the book. This is what a man's supposed to be, but that's just a tool. I need to see that demonstrated somewhere. So
I like how you mentioned the aspect of demonstration because can't remember the psychologist that spoke about children don't learn from the things they hear,
yeah,
but from the things they see.
yes.
And you coming from the perspective of the church and whatnot. And I mean, we have so much questions sometimes as it pertains to the pastors and the leaders, not just in the church, but just from so many of these religious bodies based on the example that they perpetuate themselves. Michael, psychologist James Gilligan, in his book Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, wrote, "I have yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed or humiliated by what I would call a loss of face." And John Bradshaw, in his work Healing the Shame That Binds You, described toxic shame as a corrosive force, one that convinces a man that he's not just flawed, but fundamentally unworthy.
Mm.
So when a man fails to meet society's expectations, when he can't provide, protect, or lead in the way he's been told that he must, when he feels powerless, invisible, or misdefined, do you believe that this internalized toxic shame becomes the emotional soil in which frustration, detachment, and even criminal behavior take root? And in your experience, is society too quick to punish the symptom while ignoring the soul wound beneath it all?
100%. So I did an initiative. This is well over a decade ago, when I was pastoring, and of course I've who I was then and the way I understood the world in a weaponized religious context and us them religion,
Mm.
a privatized religious context. I no longer ascribe to that, but my work at that time, as I was seeing God as much larger than the church, I began to deal with an initiative on something I called Murder-Free City. I was living in Jacksonville at that time. It was the murder capital of Florida. And there was an article in the paper called Homicide 360, and they were trying to just explain what had happened in the years before. And Jacksonville's a big, small town, and we were 100 murders, 114 murders, which was a lot. I think we were higher murder rate than Miami at the time, which has historically been known, especially in the late 80s and 90s. But I read this article, and I said, I want to meet with you. And so I met with a reporter, and I said, okay, I read your article, but what is the stuff you could not print? What is the stuff you did not print? And he said, in almost every family, every victim's family, every perpetrator and every perpetrator's family, he said, in almost everything, you talk about that provocation. He said, there were people, he said, in almost every homicide I examined for the past X number of years, people who carry around this idea that if anyone ever does X to me, if anyone ever slights me or shames me or commits any action that makes me feel less than, that makes me feel excluded, belittled, insufficient, inadequate, he said almost everyone had already prophesied and projected in their heads what they would do in that case. He said they had developed this from childhood of not being pushed around or not being ignored or not being dismissed or, on and on and on. And he said it was only a matter of time in our city before two people that had that same expectation, if anybody else becomes a voice in my life of the lack of validation, lack of approval, lack of wholeness and worth, if anybody comes and challenges that, I've already said, here's what I would do. I would kill them. I wouldn't tolerate that. I would do this. I would do that. And he said, Mike, over time, year after year, those people find each other in a city. And by the time they get to that, they're only carrying out roles of that they've already predetermined would be their response to it. And so, think about fathering. If my son ever said this, if my son ever did this, if my son, boy, I would do this to him. And so we learn this, and mothering too, before we're turned over to the world of men, we start in the care of women. We start first under their tutelage, and so much time, violence from our mothers, right? Violence from shame from our mothers, belittling from our mothers, rejection from our mothers. All of these things build this internal self-concept, again, going back to negative, and we enter into the world with that. And when we enter into the world with that, we enter into the world projecting or prophesying what would happen if, and eventually the world sets us up for that. If a woman ever cheated on me, man, I'd kill her where she stood. If a man ever disrespected my wife, I blah, 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 blah. Somebody ever talked to my child that way, and we end up projecting ourselves into a place where eventually there is a scenario where all the winds and all the currents align, and I'm now stepping into a role. And there is in everyone, right, that type of aggression. There is in everyone that capacity for violence. But you have to have something in your life, in your soul, in your environment, in your tutelage, in your rearing, that points to that higher self. Because you watch two little kids, and you took my crayons, and instantly, it's bared teeth and claws instantly. So you have to have something that acknowledges that, but then says, now let's redirect another way to if somebody does that to you, what are we going to project? Well, I'm just going to walk away and do so-and-so, or I'm going to tell so-and-so. And in the absence of that training, that track, and developing that internal thing of, if this happens to me, here's how I respond. And parents know this especially. And I've dealt with my daughter, and she had an interaction with a boy that was kind of just, there's a lot of stuff. I come from a whole line of people that don't believe conversation is the solution of everything. They're incredibly violent. We just figure this out, with a lot of different ways. And I have to talk myself out of that in narrative, because when something happened with my daughter and this boy did this, I immediately went into projecting, well, here's what I've got to do in order to do that, or I'll be weak as a man. And I've told my children, listen, I try to keep myself centered in that, again, going to the psychological, that large self, because there is enough demands on me to fulfill. And who knows how far back the shame goes? Who knows how far back the neglect of a reinforced sense of self and ego? Who knows how far back that goes in me? But it's almost like you have crossed my territory, and now I've created a vacuum. I've got to push back with this in the most extreme means possible. And I think that that is not only something that you would say exists in people who commit crime. I would say that exists in people every single day
Yeah.
who transgress on our property. Anybody comes on my property, anybody touches my car, anybody, this kind of thing. We project that, and then we find ourselves being carried on a moving sidewalk into a role of violence that preceded the act, that the mindset preceded the action. And again, we want to kill the tree by cutting off the leaves, but there has to be that root exploration, that root attention.
It's something you say that because, I was a cop for over 25 years. So I would see some of the things that the criminal minds would have done. And I recall saying to a buddy one time, whatever they can do, I have the capacity to do it as well. So I was willing, and I used to say, I think sometimes they need to recognize that what they think they could do, others can do it as well.
That's it.
So I'm hearing you say that because indeed we all have the capacity to do so many things. But one of the questions that is coming to mind as you're speaking is, what grounded you? What was it? You said you came from a lineage of persons that may have been aggressive, that dealt with things a particular way. But what was it about you that caused you to stop for a minute and to contemplate about what you should do before doing anything at all?
So I come from multi-generational alcoholics. I come from multi-generational addicts. Everybody's divorced, abuse, molestation, violence. I have memories of being at family gatherings and uncles turning to violence, and even uncle turning on his own father, on my grandfather, and just everybody. I mean, just a lot of dark stuff. My mother was, she was divorced, she was abused, she was sexually assaulted multiple times and raped, and dealt with her own stuff. And coming up in those early years as a single mom, she was a wonderful mom, but I think a lot of her rage and her pain spilled over onto me, and um, and for me, the interruption of those falling dominoes. My wife and I celebrate 24 years married here this year, which is a miracle in my family, because people don't stay married in my family. Uh, Addiction is an interesting thing. I just met my birth father for the first time, like since I was very little, after over 40 years. And I just, looked at how addiction just ravaged his life. Of course, now you look at me, I'm 70 pounds overweight. Those compulsive behaviors can take on many forms. Mercifully, mine did not take on alcohol, although I started drinking when I was 10 and smoking when I was 11 and doing drugs when I was 12. For me, what interrupted it was I got in the church. And again,
Right.
the part of, the parts of religion that I disagree with are the now where I am now is the private salvific ideas that we have the remedy by which a person can escape God's eternal judgment and wrath. And you got to sign up for our team. And if you don't sign up for our team, well, sorry, hell is your destination. That's the context in which my religious upbringing. Well, I never went to church. My mother was abused. There was abuse going on by a leader in a church. And so she didn't want to have anything to do with church. But when I stumbled in 15, 16 years old, I bought into the weaponized context of the us, them, the false contra Christ ideas of religion. And I carried that, and it was a blinder on me up until my 40s, even though I knew something intuitively was wrong. But what it did good for me was put me in a place of accountable community. What it did good for me, and I had a pastor who was very diligent in the scripture, was very diligent teaching the fruit of the Spirit, and teaching humility, and teaching honoring of your spouse, and teaching the respect of women. I liken it in some ways to Malcolm X, and I'm being very careful with that comparison, because he's somebody I consider to be a great man, one of the greatest Americans of the 20th century, maybe even more than that. Who he was as a man, right? What the nation taught him as a man, as the respect of women, as the respect of himself, as the respect of his temple purity and the dignity of people. I think he came out of it later and said, the way that was framed was not the way I think, and starting the OAAU and all these different things. I think he came past the weaponized doctrine, but he could not
Yes.
deny what it had done for him to turn him into the man that he was. And I'm that same thing. There was something that said, you don't have to carry out these behaviors. And I sat under a man of God. I sat under my spiritual father. And he just showed me the way. And what's interesting is all he had was the scriptures, because he did not have out of his own background, out of his own, from his father. His father was an officer, right? His father was, raised in the time before timeout, when it was knockout, right? I mean, he remembered his dad told him one time at 16 to do something for the trash or whatever. And he said, I'm not going to do that. I don't have time for that. And he said he woke up, his dad had punched him, knocked him out in the back of the head. So he grew up with this tremendous dysfunction, parented with that any disagreement by my children is a sign of rebellion, is a sign of bringing Satan into the house, and he disciplined that way. And all the scriptures, I don't care how much your child screams, beat the hell out of them. And because he was a true believer, he did that. He came out of that years later and said, my God, I did what I thought was right. I did what I thought the Bible wanted me to do. I did what I thought all my other spiritual leaders were wanting me to do. But somehow in what he didn't have, in the missing pieces, he was able to give to the congregation. He certainly was able to give to me that level of humility, that level of respect for my wife, that level of compassion with children. So what I observed was kind of even different than the mandate he was trying to fulfill according to the Bible. Now he's in his 60s now and has completely come out and said, man, that was wrong. I did it wrong, and worked on reconciling with his children. He said, I didn't want to go to hell, and I was doing what I thought was God's way, and it was not God's way at all. But somehow, even in what he couldn't see, his blind spots, because he's a great man, even with the weaponized religion that framed the foundation for our relationship, which I no longer ascribe to, somehow in that, again, like Minister Malcolm, some good came to me, and it turned me into I don't know if I'm a good man or not. I don't know if I'm a good husband or a father, but my God, I'm certainly, hopefully, putting better into the world with my own kids than I received.
Right. Well, they did say, a broken clock tells the time correct at
Yes.
least twice for the day.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah. And my pastor and his wife, my spiritual mother, and really she led the way, because she was like, look, I hear this, I see the scriptures, this can't be right. And it created a lot of tension, and they share in their testimony that they got close to divorce. And I didn't really mean to turn this into a spiritual thing, but this is what framed me. Even though I operate out in the secular world, the deep connection to spiritual things and to spiritual people. And of course, I'm this white kid I'm a white kid in Orlando, Florida, this entirely white world. And then I end up on the south side of Atlanta, College Park, Georgia, where I am not many white people in any direction for miles. And I come to this very much non-white world and found family and
Right.
was taught line upon line. I mean, you're talking 3 or 4 services a week, sometimes 7 services a week, from age 16 all the way up to age 29. That's a lot of micro exposures to a larger way, micro exposures to the idea of putting the large self ahead of the small self. And that little exposure, it changes us imperceptibly. You can't really tell day to day, but as I look back over a decade, and my God, now I've been married 25 years, and I made mistakes as a father, and I'm in my early days, and I'm trying to not parent, I'm not going to parent from fear. I'm not going to parent from anger. I'm not going to parent from, if I don't do X, Y, and Z to you, you're going to turn out to be terrible. And, so much of the false idea of Christian and a lot of other faiths is, I have to punish you and harm you now, because if I don't do it to you now, God will do it to you in the future. And so all these deceptions, it takes a while to deprogram ourselves from them. But that's
Yes.
one of the great things of grandparents, right? It's the great do-over that my mom said. She said, Mike, I didn't have it when I was raising you. I snapped at my daughter one time when she was 3. I said, sit down and be quiet. And my mom said, hey, don't do that. And I'm like, don't do that. You would have knocked me out if I had done that. She said, yep. And I was blind and I was ignorant and I thought kids were to be managed and I was dealing with my own pain. She said, please let my hindsight become your foresight and do better with your children. And so I think that's the best any of us can hope for.
Wow. Author Yasmin Mogahed once wrote, "The worst prison is not made of metal bars. The worst prison is when your internal reality does not match your external reality."
Mm, mm,
And I can't help but reflect on this within the context of our conversation about shame, performance, and the expectations placed on men. Would you say that many men today are walking around incarcerated by expectations they didn't choose, appearing strong on the outside but internally fractured, silenced, or even emotionally lost? And how does this inner dissonance, this mismatch between who a man really is and who he's forced to be in society, contribute to the way behaviors later label as failure, dysfunction, or even crime? And more importantly, how do we help men escape that prison before they end up in a literal one?
mm, mm. So, um, again, I go back to, um, well, let me back up. So much of what men are shamed for um, are simply parts of being human. Men deal, I think, with a lot of sexual shame. Um, I think men deal with a lot of performance-based shame. One of the things Connie and I did, and my wife and I did in our house, was we didn't raise our kids with chores. We raised our kids with a sense of community. Um, I'm the first to get up from the dinner table and say, "Hey, can I get you a drink? You drinking water? Get my wife something. Get my son something. Get my daughter something." I'm the first to hop up, and I got all the dishes. Don't worry about it. I cook. I clean. We work, because one of the things that happens is there's the sexual side, but then there's the performance side, which is parents set up as these kind of little despots, rulers, and the children become minions. And now there's conflict of, you're not performing it according to my expectations or my timeline. And so the rift of, I'm a performance failure. And then they get out and measure what the idea of success looks like, that success does not look like character. Success looks like accomplishment, prestige, and possession, right? And if I've not measured up to that, then, to me, honestly, and I think one of the worst agitations of our contentment, the worst agitations of our self concept, is this false, cruel idea of potential. Of, here's what you could have been or what you should have been, and now we end up in a competition, ashamed of our own capacity, our own failure to live up to that capacity, and I should have been this, and I was attract this, and I was this, and I had my tryout, but I didn't train right, and I messed up this, and now I'm struggling just as an everyday worker, and the shame of, had I only just trained instead of partying for my tryout, my family wouldn't be. So it's just this compounded shame. And it is true, it becomes a prison. There's an accuser. You're accusing yourself for failing this relationship or that, accusing yourself of failing your child, or failing your career, or failing your education, or failing as a sexual being, or failing in your marriage as a partner. And those are prisons. And um, they uh, they in many ways render us impotent, right? We get stuck in the cycle of the gap between the expectation of society and ourselves and where we actually are, and the gap becomes the dominant narrative. Instead of taking our dominion, not can we cross the bridge between who we are and what we are supposedly could have been, but can we simply, in some micro way, take a new level of dominion to become a better version of ourselves? And so, again, there's a statistic, and I know, statistics, um, um, they can be flimsy. But one of the things I read one time is that the number of people who are in prison for something that took place in an 8-second span of their life. And I am convinced that this pre-engineering, this pre-expectation, if this ever happened, then I would. They find themselves in a situation and in something that is about 8 seconds, a decision that took place in an 8-second span. I'm convinced that as soon as that judge's gavel hits, that the veil comes off of that, and we see now what happened? Another level of compounding shame. And I
Yes.
think that what has to happen is we have to carve out room for the normalcy of just being normal, the normalcy of average, the normalcy of there's a fact of a range of normal, that any of these things are acceptable versions. And I mean, there's certainly things that are outside of normal, but what we have as a society is that the abnormal appears normal. And that's because there's an issue in the thinker, the feeler, and the chooser. Sometimes the abnormal appears normal. Sometimes the normal appears as normal. You walk into a house and you greet your wife and you greet your children. I had a pastor friend of mine, a different pastor friend of mine from Lagos. He said he was visiting a very well known pastor, elderly kind of statesman in the church, and he said this young preacher, he was just excited and to meet this giant in the faith. He said we were having dinner, and he said, in the middle of our dinner, we're having this deep spiritual conversation. He said, the doors open. He said, the guy's son came in. The guy was in his late 80s or whatever. The guy's son came in, and then his grandson came in, and then the great grandkids came in. He said, they came in, they jumped in the guy's lap. They started kissing him, and he started talking. Oh, my gosh. Da, da, da. He said, the preacher, my friend from Nigeria, said, the preacher forgot I was even there. He said, he forgot I was even there. And he said, I kept waiting for the man to rebuke the children. He said, I kept waiting for them to say, get away. And he said, I was shocked. He said, because in my house, he said, my mother and my siblings and I, we stood against the wall while my father ate. And when he was done, then we sat down. And he said, if the food was good, good for my mother. He said, if the food was not right, he said it was bad for everybody. He said, and I was in my 40s now, having my normal. He said, I was looking at something that was normal and healthy, but it struck me as abnormal. Why? Because of the conditioning of the thinker, the feeler, and the chooser. So how can we stop that? How can we prevent that? We got to stop playing games. And again, I go back to church. I go back to faith systems, because that's the most common way people are exposed to new thought. And when we're playing games behind the pulpit, instead of giving people a way to live larger, a way to push back against those dysfunctional dominoes, we got creeds, we got doctrines, we got weaponized religion, who's in, who's out, who's going to hell, and politics. But we don't have a way in which people can walk out and thrive more in the micro and macro society. And so it's got to be education. If they don't get it in education, they got to get it from the parents. If they don't get it from the parents, then they got to get it from the pulpit. If they don't get it from the pulpit, then they got to get it from social media. How can we create messages that shape thoughts, right? Those thoughts and emotions shape worldviews. Those worldviews shape the approach and response to life. Those approaches and responses shape decisions. Those decisions shape actions. If we're going to get with the actions, we've got to back all the way up to that messaging that initially shapes that thought and that worldview.
Yeah, yeah. I had to go right to the source of it. You've alluded to this, you've just mentioned it again, but the weaponized aspect of the church. And it seems that both the state and the church have leaned heavily on fear as the primary tool to shape behavior, whether it's the fear of prison through the court of law or the fear of hell through the doctrines of religion. As someone who has been in the pulpit and a pastor for quite some time, do you believe society has become more invested in controlling men through punishment rather than healing? The wounds that often lead to their dysfunction in the first place. And if fear is no longer a sustainable guide, what might be a truly redemptive model of justice look like? One rooted not in fear, but in transformation.
Okay. Again, I love this. All right. So here we go. I do have thoughts on that. I'm convinced that until you get out of a weaponized, salvific view of, there's two things, right? You can step entirely out of a theological view or deistic view or a theistic view, and therefore there is no mind or meaning in the cosmos, and that's a very cold world. But sometimes we think that you can be either there is no mind or meaning in the cosmos. The cosmos is empty and it's indifferent, and therefore our indifferent behavior in it, or that we could choose altruism or cannibalism. It really doesn't matter. They're just two sides of the same coin. There's that extreme view, which almost nobody holds to. But we think the only alternative to that is a weaponized religious view, which is our team, our tribe has the private answer. We have the private God. We have to market that God to you, take that God to you, and we do that under threat of temporal and eternal punishment. That right now, you as a society, your nation, your tribe, your dominant religion is not our dominant religion, and so therefore your bloodshed is not as dastardly, and the tears of your mothers are not quite as precious in the eyes of God as maybe the tears of our chosen people. And so all sorts of justified violence, right? So this doctrinal violence leading to a rhetorical violence, making way for a practiced violence, political and practiced violence. And I'm convinced now that until you separate yourself from that the fear of hell, the fear of eternal punishment becoming the dominant theme through which individuals operate, families operate, societies and voters operate, until you get away from that falsehood, until you get away from the fundamental unjustness of that idea that somehow, because of my proximity, I happen to be born closer to or more saturated in the private salvific truth than someone born elsewhere or in a different win. Until you shed and remove that from your thinking, you can't really even approach society in a whole way. And I know that's dangerous, because that means that our voters and our politics and our politicians, um, they have yet to say the silent part out loud to themselves, and they have yet to pronounce to them, to their own thinking, and then out into the larger world, that the private parts of weaponized religion are just they're unconscionable. So that's the start, because when you move from the us them idea that I'm on the right team, believing the right things, doing the right creed, and everybody who does not do that are God's temporal and eternal enemies, then who cares that this person died, or who cares that the bomb went off there, or who cares that that's where their tsunami hit? It's certainly not me. And so there's this dehumanizing layer, this dehumanizing film that deadens the empathetic capacity that this false idea of religion does to us. We're not able to see and feel each other properly. So on the macro, until a society removes itself from that as its driving thing. The saying that I think that I way like to say is, religion is everything, politics is the rest, right? My view of God is everything, or no God is everything, and then the rest is how I implement that politically. And so if we're not going to free ourselves from that on the macro, then we've got to free ourselves from that on the micro and move to some form of true religion, which true religion, whatever it is, cannot be privatized. There certainly can be multiple private paths to it that bring us to the large truth, but it cannot be that my group owns the only way of eliminating or escaping divine wrath. And until we divest ourselves of that individually, we're not going to be able to do it, on the micro to the macro. But here's where that leads. This shapes now our idea of laws and law enforcement. Maybe we could get to the place where we say, well, if God would not do, if God is in any way connected with love, if in any way you understand through your religious tradition or anything else, or even your, God or no God, that love, that empathetic sight and response, that empathetic, compassionate, charitable action is somehow at the root of your religious or non-religious lens, then maybe that now can move to that if there is punishment from God, I don't think there is, that it would have to be restorative in nature instead of punitive. And until you get to that as an individual, it's not going to shape your politics and your voting. Until you get to that as a society, it's not going to dominate how we legislate. And so I do think that society in general has to be protected. I believe that if God is real, that if God exists, that all human beings are one sight of God away from a transformation that would move them out of violence, etc. I mean, that's the whole point of all the religious narratives. Whether they're literally true or not, they certainly function to the point of that you take Moses or Saul or any of these other people, that they were going along their merry way, Buddha, and then all of a sudden they came to enlightenment. And if all human beings are one enlightenment away from transformation, then maybe as we adjudicate and maybe as we punish, we can do something with that redemptive view in mind instead of that punitive view. But I was in a meeting one day and we were talking about gay marriage. This is a number of years ago, and in the early aughts, I guess. and about domestic partnerships, and should it was a town hall meeting, and should gay and lesbian couples, okay, they can have a domestic partnership, but should they be able to qualify for insurance benefits? And I kid you not, a man stood up in the middle of the thing and said, well, what difference does it make if they get health insurance? They're both going to hell. And this is my entirety of the point, which is what? Because my spiritual view dominates how I see people. God's
Right.
going to get them. Who cares if they can't get chemo? I mean, what difference does that make? And if you can't pull the matrix, you can't disconnect yourself from the matrix in that context, then however we say we're protecting society, right? If we're protecting society from rape, or we're protecting society from robbery, we're protecting society from violence, and we have prison systems, or we have, penal systems, or justice systems, if those justice systems mirror the false concept of false religious justice, and if the people that vote and accept and see those as normal are by and large rooted in that false concept of justice, I think, again, on the ground, we just have to vote and to speak and to put out messages. But as you work to the core of the thing, to the heartbeat, to the pulse of it, you've got to keep renewing people to just challenge that false, unconscionable view.
But how do we get there, though? How do we get
Conversations like this. I mean, if anybody watches this, maybe this is the one. I mean, think of these dominoes, tick, 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 tick. Maybe something like this just puts a hand in it and stops it, and somebody goes, "Wow, you've brought another thought. You've introduced information into the system, and now I will metabolize. Now I will, and you say, well, my God, I mean." Who's that going to change? Well, it changed me. A conversation changed me. A book changed me. A podcast changed me. I mean, that's one of the most dangerous things that we have happening right now with the curation of information based on fear, the curation of fed information. I mean, that your news and my neighbor's news all look completely different based on the algorithm. That's what makes it dangerous. And so we must put out things that challenge that philosophy, things that challenge the strongholds. One of the definitions of strongholds that I like is a house constructed of thoughts. It's this kind of reinforced normalization. It's this reinforced idea that that the way I perceive it is the only way to perceive it. The 7 most dangerous words. We've never heard it that way before, but maybe this is the function of prophets and shamans and philosophers, and maybe this is the function, to scream out and to provoke and to challenge and to stir that there is a higher way. But you can't really get that. You mentioned the TED Talk. And when I did the TED Talk, that was me taking my deeply religious conviction out to a place where it really mattered. And see, people say, I don't know if I agree with that. It doesn't matter that you agree with that. I had to say something to push back on the normalcy of this 300-year-old, 250-year-old, 300-year-old narrative concerning blackness and criminality and hypersexuality and all of these supremacist narratives. I put it out. And you know what? Maybe the 10 million people that have seen the talk in different versions, maybe 9.5 million of them said, maybe all it did was bounce against their preconceived ideas. But maybe there were a few that little thing fell in, and they thought, boy, I need to look at the world different. And I tell you, if I didn't believe that was useful, if I didn't find some sort of power in pushing against it in that way, that'd be a very difficult world, because for me, I would just move to inaction, right? I would just move, well, then I'm not doing anything. Just let me find a way to become a stockbroker and get rich, and let everybody just get it. Why? Because I'm white and I'm privileged, and I'm, English is my primary language in a country where, that suits me well. What do I care about anybody else? And if it's pointless to talk, if it's pointless to use my voice, then I'm not going to use my voice. Let me make my money and eat my, my bonbons and going about my life. So I could be deceived that this is useful, but but maybe it's a benevolent deception, because maybe it gives me some futile Sisyphusian preoccupation that I can talk to you and hope that maybe one person in a place of power hears it and comes out of this seeing the world a different way.
It reminds me of a statement that Tupac Shakur had made. He said, I may not be the one to change the world, but I may spark the one that will change the world.
There you go.
Michael, we've been speaking for an hour. It feels like 5 minutes. It looks like I could speak to you for the next 2 hours. So
This has been
before we
beautiful.
close,
This has been beautiful.
yeah, before we close though, I want to give you the space to share what's on your heart, whether it's to men, to leaders, to the broken, to the hopeful. What final truth, reflection, or revelation would you leave with us? Something you believe the world most needs to hear right now and maybe still isn't ready to receive?
Believe your religion, but only insofar as it helps you connect empathetically with the rest of the world. If you have to believe in some form of salvation for your soul, how will my soul not perish? Let it be that you pursue salvation by seeing your fellow human beings and easing suffering. Let it be not that you signed up for the right thing and have bought into the right group and you're the only one that's going to have a chair when the music stops. But if you are a person of faith, and I know not all of you are, but if you are, and you want to have eternal life, make your core belief that the only way to get there is to see suffering, to see injustice, and in some small way to ease it, to push back on it, to turn it in another direction, or even to just validate the dignity of those who are its objects. This is the only true religion. So stay in your mosque, stay in your temple, stay in your shul, right? Stay in your church, stay in your synagogue, stay there. That's great. But when you leave, if it's helping you, let it help you. But know that its only real usefulness is not something that tells you you're right and everybody else is wrong. It's something that provokes in you the sight that you could see others and look at them long enough till you see self. See who you are when you see darkness and evil, and see who you are when you see failings and frailty, and see who you could be when you see suffering, and respond to that in humility and active compassion. I know that sounds like a sermon. I know that sounds crazy, but I think because 94% of people in the United States consider themselves some form of spirituality, 74% consider themselves active in a Christian faith, I'm speaking to the largest numbers, and I'm saying to this, your religion is great. I've been there, I've done that. But the only part of it that's useful is that you walk out the door. And you don't have to look around the world, to the third world, the second world, the first world. You just got to look right across your own table. Look at the people walking, riding with you on the way home, eating dinner with you, and say, I'm going to see you as a human. I'm going to respond to you as a human. My son, my daughter, my wife, that you were having a human experience, and I want to be an agent of good and dignity and blessing to that. And I want to be an agent of God, the presence of God, the love of God in your life. And I know there are many people say, man, what are you talking about? That may not be the language you speak, but I promise the people that vote and shape this country, that is the language that they speak. And that is the message that I would want each one of them to hear.
Wow, Michael, that is deep. And it's not just the words that you spoke, but I felt it.
Mm.
I felt the place it came from.
Mm.
You know, and why I say that, immediately I'm reflecting on that situation with the Jesus, whether literal or not, when he said, he without sin cast the first stone. I always reflect on that because I said, if I said it, that stone would have still been cast. It might have been
Yeah,
cast
yeah,
at me,
yeah, yeah.
right? But
Yes.
what was profound was not what was said, but the place it came from. And I really felt what you've just shared. And I really hope that people would feel that and recognize the depths of which you've shared it from. You know, I want to thank you so much, Michael, for this deeply enriching conversation. Before we wrap up, could you share with our listeners where they can connect with you further, whether that's through your books, your teachings, or any platforms where your work is available?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for that. MichaelandConnie.com, that's my website. My wife and I, we do everything together. Again, going back to earlier, as equals, as partners, as co-laborers. michaelandconnie.com. You can find all of our books. You can find out information about our church that's not really a church, but trying to bring true religion to the world of people of faith or no faith, trying to to borrow religious articulation to point to deeply human ideas. You can find us on YouTube at Michael and Connie. All of our messages and thoughts are there. You can follow on social media. I am at It's Regular Mike on all of the majors of social, and just sharing that, and not trying to be above anyone, but to try to, as a fellow traveler, as a sympathetic co-sitter in the dysfunction and the pain of humanity, just trying to bring some light into it. And so thank you very much for allowing me to share that. And if you want to connect, that's how you can find me.
And of course, all that you outlined, I would include that in the description below. So you could just see the description below. You're going to see all that he just outlined, his website and whatnot. I would include it. You know, what a conversation. And if today's episode stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or even wrestle with the truth, then that's exactly what this space is built for. Because healing isn't quiet. Truth isn't comfortable. And transformation, it takes an audacious spirit. So if you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, click the notification bell and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. A brother, a father, a son, a friend who's still searching for their voice in this world. This is the path of the audacious rebel, where we speak what others won't, we ask what others fear, and we move not just for change, but for awakening. Until next time, stay bold, stay awake, and above all, stay audacious.
Audacious rebel. Audacious rebel.